Good evening and welcome to the second Council Residential Districting Commission meeting of the year. My name is Avery Frost and I'm one of the commissioners of the CRDC. With me today are my fellow commissioners, Dave Paul, Jeff Cabot, Monica Sarazuela, and Commission Chair Malik Moore. The Council Residential Districting Commission is a collective of residents formed to draw maps creating 9 residential districts in Columbus. We're excited to begin the 2021 districting work by hearing presentations from more local experts this week that will educate us as well as our viewers on important contextual information before we begin gathering feedback from the public. A reminder, this meeting is currently live on Facebook, YouTube, and CTV, Columbus's government television channel 3. And throughout the meeting, if you have questions, please ask them in the Facebook or YouTube comment section, and we will do our best to answer them. We want to thank and welcome our presenters. Kyle Strickland, analyst at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and Doreen Uhas Sauer, the University Area Commission Chair and Education Coordinator for Columbus Landmarks. This evening, we will hear a presentation from Kyle on the Voting Rights Act and its implications as it relates to districting. We'll hear a presentation from Doreen on the history of Columbus and Columbus neighborhoods, and we'll answer questions submitted by residents through the Facebook and YouTube chat. Without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Kyle to discuss the Voting Rights Act. Kyle, thank you for joining us this evening.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here. Grateful for you all, and then for you all who are listening in. It is good to see this great commission coming together to talk about some important issues here in this city, and then as it relates to our broader community. So I believe we've got Nai who's going to help me with opening up the screen share here with the PowerPoint, and then we'll get started here in a second.
I am pulling up your presentation, Kyle.
Excellent. All right. So again, everyone, my name is Kyle Strickland. I'm a senior legal analyst at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Today, I'm going to have a conversation about the Voting Rights Act and redistricting. These are important implications for us to all think about, both on the commission level, but also the general public, to think about the types of questions that we can ask as it relates to some of these issues. And I'm looking forward to the discussion in the presentation. So first, I want to give everyone a kind of a high-level understanding of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. So we are a land-grant-based research institute at The Ohio State University that works on issues to create a just and inclusive society where all people and communities have the opportunity to succeed. And we do that through looking at issues of race and ethnicity and the implications about broader structures in society. And we'll get to what I mean by that. So talking about things like implicit bias, talking about things like systemic racism. But we do that through a variety of ways in our work. And that's through research. So doing extensive research in the community, but also through the literature on issues of race and ethnicity. And then a key part of our work is applied research. And the way we do that is through community engagement, just like with forums today, but also just generally engaged in the community. And then the advocacy piece is where the community comes in. This is, as a research-based institute, we provide the information and the resources, and then it's up to the community to do that with what they ultimately decide to do. And then ultimately in this work, especially when we're talking about the issues that we talk about, these issues are difficult. These issues are challenging. And so we need some inspiration in the work along the way, because without that, we're not going to get to where we need to be. And it's going to take all of us in this work. So how do we approach our work? So we look at our work through two main lenses. One lens is race and cognition. That's the role of individual level thoughts and actions in maintaining systems of discrimination. This is important to think about as you think about terms like implicit bias or unconscious bias that people might have. They may not be intentionally upholding their biases or past structures around discrimination. However, that can play a role in which it has an understanding and affects society and how we maintain our interactions and interpersonal interactions with one another. So we have that understanding because it's important, because not everything is explicit. It's also about what are those the psychology of some of those thoughts and actions, stereotypes, narratives that we might hold that actually maintain discrimination in society. And then one of the other important pieces is structural racialization. This is really important when we think about the context of Voting Rights Act, when we think about the context of redistricting. This is actually a look at the influence of our country's racial history on policies, practices, and values that actually perpetuate racial inequity over time. This is where you might hear things like systemic racism. It's looking at not an individual and their types of actions as an individual, but what types of policies, what types of practices and institutions have we had in place that perpetuate inequity over time. And it's critical that we look at that work because it plays out all across the country. And this next map that I'm about to show you highlights just my point. So this map here is from a report that we actually did for the city of Columbus as part of the My Brother's Keeper initiative. This was the Renewing Our Call to Action report in 2017. And this report right here, this picture that you can see on the screen, shows the city of Columbus's racial distribution of youth population. If you notice by census tract, if you look at the key, what you have there are the predominant districts. This is related to young people in the city of Columbus. You see the blue key represents a white. That's the predominant ethnicity of that census tract. And then the red is black. And you see the predominant ethnicity of each of those census tracts. And what you can very clearly see here in the city of Columbus is a clear divide between the east and the west sides of the city. And a lot of that split is the CSX railroad tracks as well as the highway, the 71 highway, and you see some of that split both on the east and west sides of the city of Columbus. What's important to know about this map is that this actually isn't unique with major metropolitan areas all across the country. This is part of a larger pattern as it relates to housing segregation, as it relates to a whole host of different issues. And because of past policies over time, what you then have are predominantly people living in predominantly black census tracts or predominantly white census tracts, and you have some census tracts that's predominantly Asian in some areas. This is the pattern that you see all across the country, and we'll get to exactly why that is, but it's important to keep this map in context for because while this is with youth population, this is also reflective and looks similar when you add it to all adults. But it's important to keep this into context as we think about districting, right? And about where different wards are going to be placed and understanding how this makeup of the way that the racial distribution of population is distributed is going to have an impact in terms of what it looks like when we're actually drawing wards or drawing maps more broadly. So you look at that map, and one of the things that comes to mind sometimes is you see this clear, a lot of people see that line, they say it's segregation. But what they see here is that some people make the conversation that this is just inevitable and that just people are deciding to live with people that look like them and there's no other reason to it. When in fact, this quote by Carl Nightingale actually tells you this history, not just in the United States, but all across the world. This quote, segregation never comes about just because it just is, as the term de facto might also suggest. The bottom line is this: segregation has always involved some form of institutionally organized human intentionality, just as those institutions have always depended on more broadly held beliefs, ideas, and customs to sustain their power. And why is this important? Well, one, it highlights that what has happened in terms of the ways in which where people live and the way in which the types of job opportunities that they may or may not have has less to do with individual actions and more to do with systemic structural policies of the past. And we're going to highlight that in the next slide, an example. So here in this next slide, you have two slides here, and there's one, a redlining map from Columbus, Ohio in 1936, and I believe last week as well, one of the presenters was talking about the redlining map. And then we also are comparing this with a present day neighborhood opportunity index. This is one of the opportunity index that the Kirwan Institute utilizes based on a variety of different socioeconomic indicators. And so you either have areas of lower opportunity or areas of higher opportunity. And the way we measure that is based on things like proximity to jobs or proximity to higher educational levels or higher employment levels, looking at things like poverty rates in particular census tracts. And what you see here with the map of the entirety of Franklin County is relative opportunity, right? So in comparison, when you put this in scales, you see a lot of these suburb areas or even some aspects of the city of Columbus that are closer to these encountering suburbs where you see higher, darker areas of opportunity. But what you also see within the heart of the central city here is this inverted L shape that is often talked about. The mayor often talks about this, as well as many other council members and others in the community, that you see this inverted L pattern that showcases some of these neighborhoods that have lower opportunity than others and less access to the types of resources needed to thrive. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that relative to some of these other areas, there's less opportunity. And the reason why I highlight that is because that's not the fault of any one individual. That's not the fault of people living in these communities. It's the result of policies and practices that have either invested in areas or disinvested in areas. And as you can see on the left of the map here, you see the areas that are red and yellow. Those mark areas that are C or D grade neighborhoods or communities. So that's where you would actually say, well, these are not areas that are good investment. And so what ended up happening was the areas that were invested in were those areas that were listed blue or green here. And what happened then is those areas got the investments. And then what happened to the areas that did not get invested in? Well, if you were living in one of these red or yellow areas, the likelihood for you to get a loan, for example, on a home or some sort of ability to actually obtain a home and pay that down was unlikely, especially if you were Black and as part of communities of color, where they actually steered resources away from investing in these communities. And the importance of highlighting this is because there are long-term impacts. This is a redlining map from the 1930s. And if you're not able to get a loan on your home, that means you're not able to buy a home and you're not able to build equity on that home. And so maybe you have to be a renter and you're not able to pass that down from generation to generation. And the reason this is all important is because this is, again, not the result of any individual failing or individual struggles of any particular person or community, but about policies that have systematically excluded many communities, and then in this case, communities of color. Next slide. So this next slide here highlights drivers of racial segregation and opportunity isolation for communities of color. And this is important for the context of when we think about the Voting Rights Act and how our structures are set up. And I know our next presenter is going to do a fantastic job kind of highlighting specifically as it relates to Columbus neighborhoods. But we had things that we've talked about previously around zoning and land use practices, things like redlining and investment practices, urban renewal, public housing, and federal highway policies, where you had some highways that were just, and even here in the city of Columbus, where you would have highways that were built with no regard necessarily to the communities that were already there. And so you actually saw entire communities being divided. And these oftentimes were federal policies that would come into these communities. And oftentimes you actually might have little say if you are at a local level administrator or even a local level policymaker, because these were decisions made at the federal level. And sometimes when these decisions were handed down at the local level, what ended up happening? Well, the implementation was often exclusionary. And if it didn't happen through policy, what you also saw was actual explicit racial discrimination and intimidation practices. And so what happens were, even if you were able to make it through all of the different barriers of policy along the way, you would encounter and confront racism, discrimination, and oppression. And so as a result, it made it difficult for you to use opportunities, which led to racial segregation and opportunity isolation. So this next slide talks a little bit about some of the barriers to voting rights. And we have a long history in this country of voting, voter discrimination and the barriers. There's always been a struggle to expand the franchise from the 15th Amendment to the 19th Amendment, gave women the right to vote, all the way to the 24th Amendment to end the poll tax. But there were these types of policies that were put in place ever since, the passage of the 15th Amendment, where Black men were granted the right to vote in the 1800s. What ended up happening, though, was that even if you constitutionally had the ability to vote, there were all sorts of barriers and nefarious ways in which people and institutions would set it up so that it made it difficult for you to actually be able to vote. So things like grandfather clauses. In Louisiana, they were one of the first states to set these grandfather clauses, which basically said that if you were a descendant of an enslaved person, then as a result, you would not be able to vote. So the question was effectively, if your grandfather could vote, then you can vote. And oftentimes in this situation, what happened was you look back even your previous generation, and you had somebody who was enslaved, because this is shortly after having the civil rights movement. And so people couldn't actually vote. And so these clauses were designed to specifically exclude Black people from voting. Then you had things like literacy tests. So you would have tests. So before you could go vote, you had to pass all sorts of tests and questions that you had to answer that most people didn't understand. And certainly if you're not getting the same educational access, you're not getting the same access to resources, you fundamentally wouldn't be able to pass these tests. And ultimately, if you couldn't pass the test, then you couldn't vote. And the picture here that we have here is the poll tax. So if you were able to vote, you had to pay a poll tax in order to vote. So what did that mean? That meant that if you were struggling, you didn't have the resources, the ends to be able to afford the ability to vote, then your rights were ultimately infringed upon because you had to pay a poll tax that many couldn't afford. This also hurts some poor whites, but especially Black individuals and communities of color. And then, as I mentioned before, violence and intimidation was a rampant practice, especially after Reconstruction, when there was opportunities to expand the franchise. What ended up happening was a Reconstruction era that was met with violence and intimidation all throughout the South, but also throughout the North and other parts of the United States of America, where it was harder and harder to vote and to cast a ballot. And even if you, again, as I discussed previously, as it related to redlining and zoning, even if you were able to make it past all of these barriers, you still face the threats of intimidation, violence, discrimination, lynching. This happened all across this country. It's an ugly history and sometimes isn't talked about, but it's worth talking about because there has been a lot to fight and struggle for the right to vote. So this ties to voting rights and racial justice. If we look to where we are today, we would not be here if you do not make the connection to voting rights and the Voting Rights Act. So we have here as a picture on March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, the Selma to Montgomery marches, John Lewis standing there, but many others like Amelia Boynton and other leaders in this movement who marched for the right to vote, who marched for civil rights. And we saw what occurred on this Sunday, the devastation and the brutality and the violence and the intimidation that I alluded to, which really pushed back on the franchise and the ability for people to struggle to do what was guaranteed to them in the Constitution. Because of all these barriers, the idea is that we know that this fight for voting rights is rooted in a long history of racial and gender justice, and justice that is rooted in one that says that everybody should have the ability and the freedoms that are guaranteed in the Constitution to vote, and those should not be infringed upon. And after Bloody Sunday and a lot of continued pushes around Voting Rights Act, and this happened a little over a year after the Civil Rights Act's passage, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we're going to be talking about today. This was signed into law in 1965 and is a landmark civil rights legislation that prevents the systemic and widespread discrimination, racial discrimination in voting that I had talked about. Obviously, you see King here and other leaders who made this possible, President LBJ, who made this possible, but so many others who fought along the way to make this possible. And it's important because this is 1965. For those who think about the civil rights movement as if it's like so long ago, this is not that long ago. This history it has present day impacts and effects, and we should not forget this history because the fight, the struggle for voting rights is history that makes us, has impacts of where we are today and how we move forward as a country. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act. So as I mentioned before, it's widely considered to be the single most federal statute protecting the right to vote. It contains a number of important provisions, including Section 2 and Section 5, which we'll talk about here in a minute and explain why that's relevant to this commission, as well as to every individual who's listening in. And then basically, this was adopted essentially as an enforcement mechanism of the 15th Amendment's guarantee that the right to vote cannot be abridged, quote, on account of race, color, and previous condition of servitude. Because what we saw at the beginning was, even though these freedoms were guaranteed in the Constitution, you had other policies and practices that were done along the way to keep people from voting. And later subsequent cases, this was expanded to talk about language, not to infringe upon language minorities as well, and other examples that will show why this extends to everybody to ensure that they have the right to vote. So I'm going to talk about Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so I'm not going to get super legal and get involved in the legalese with everybody as an attorney. I know sometimes I can fall into that practice. So I'm going to try to break it down here about the Voting Rights Act and why this is important specifically for this commission. So first, what is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? So there's a number of different sections and provisions, but some important ones that have really an important impact today are Section 2 and Section 5. So Section 2, what it does, it actually allows voters to seek judicial relief if they believe that a state or local government has actually denied or limited their voting rights on the basis of their race, color, or membership in a language minority group. And why is that important? So it's important, again, instead of just saying, hey, you know, I should have the right to vote and that's guaranteed to me. However, I believe that this state or locality is actually infringing on my right to vote or is denying my right to vote on the basis of my race, the color, or membership in the language minority group. And that's important. We'll get to just why here in a minute. But first, I want to also talk about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So another key provision of the Voting Rights Act is Section 5. So this is what is known as the pre-clearance requirement, which basically prohibits certain jurisdictions from implementing any change that affects voting without first receiving federal pre-approval that they change that they seek to implement doesn't discriminate against protected minorities. The reason why they had Section 5 in the Voting Rights Act is really to address the types of jurisdictions that were engaged in aggressive voter discrimination in 1965 at the time. So you had a lot of jurisdictions in the South that were engaged in a lot of aggressive voter discrimination. And so what happens then was they didn't want to put in place changes where people could make changes to their voting laws without also receiving federal pre-approval to make sure that it's not being discriminated against. We'll talk about why this is important because in Shelby v. Holder, we saw the pre-clearance requirement get struck down, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I just wanted to highlight those first two levels around Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So this picture might look familiar. So this is the Council Residential Districting Commission, which is where we are today. And its ties with the Voting Rights Act. So one of the provisions is that the maps that are ultimately created by the CRDC must comply with all applicable local, state, and federal laws, including the Voting Rights Act, specifically sections 2 and 5, which consider race as a factor. So let's talk a little bit about just the process of redistricting. I know Naya and others have talked about this, but I just want to give a little bit of a high level context and how it relates to Voting Rights Act and protections moving forward. So this picture right here talks about drawing districts. So a lot of people hear about things like gerrymandering. So we're thinking about the way redistricting occurs. Oftentimes, either at the state level, it could be congressional redistricting, or it could be done at the state house level for state legislature seats. And in this particular instance, we are talking about with the CRDC what it's going to be looking like with the map in the words for the city of Columbus. However, many of the same themes apply here because they have to align with state, local, and federal law in the Voting Rights Act. So how are differently drawn district maps and how they produce different electoral results? So oftentimes people might hear about gerrymandering. So there's a couple of different ways that you might be able to divide people into a particular set of districts here. So let's say on the far left, you have 50 people that are living in a particular community, and you have 60% orange and 40% purple. So this is effectively where, that voter block, they'll be in the orange voter block versus the 40% voter block. So there's a couple of different ways to actually have fair ways to draw the district. And those are the two maps in the middle. So basically, it's actually results that are proportionate to the electorate. So if you have 60% orange and 40% purple, then no matter how you draw these districts here in the lineup here, you want to make sure that it's proportionate. So one way to do it is actually ensuring that you have you have 3 orange to the 2 purple because it's proportionate to their vote share and the population share. And there's a number of different ways to do that. We're not going to get into all of the nuance here today. And I know the commission is going to be talking about these things, but here's a couple of different ways to do that. But ultimately, as long as you're keeping that proportionality, you should be good. But then on the far right, you have the not fair option, which basically shows results that are not proportionate to the electorate. And so if you set up districts in which you had 5 orange to 0 purple, the way you're dividing into 5 districts here, what ends up happening then is you actually have no representation for one community, and that is not proportionate to the other. A number of different ways you can do that. So here in this map, it shows 5 orange versus 0 purple, where you ultimately make up the majority of that particular district, if you see the blocks there. And then you see something on the far right, which is similar to some of the patterns that we see not only here in Ohio, but all across the country, where you see these gerrymandered maps where these maps might look like they're going all over the community and not even looking like they have any sort of boundary that makes sense. Something like this map on the far right, which shows that it actually has 2 orange and 3 purple. So you can actually draw maps in which you actually have less of a percentage and proportionality of the electorate and end up ultimately having different electoral results because your representation is overrepresented and not proportionate. And so that's just important to think about as we move forward with these maps. So minority vote dilution. We'll go to the next slide here. So how does it relate specifically to voting rights and redistricting and the history around racial justice? Well, redistricting over time has been used at times to prevent voters of color from gaining political power. So what they did is, as I showed before, they actually would draw districts in a way that results in those voters actually having less of a chance of electing their candidates of choice. This is known as minority vote dilution. And this actually is often seen through a different number of map drawing techniques, such as packing and cracking. And if you're not really familiar with a lot of the redistricting terms, you might be wondering, what does that even mean? And so I'll talk a little bit about it on this next slide. So what is packing? So these are some great resources as well, by the way, for those who are looking to get more resources around redistricting, even though not every aspect will apply in a similar way here, for example, within the city of Columbus, as it would with a state legislature or congressional districts. These are really important resources to think about. So Common Cause, we have groups like All on the Line and other groups, League of Women Voters, who talk about these different issues. So it's really important to think about if you want to do more research. I'm happy to help share that. And of course, this commission will help support that. So packing is actually used when minority voters are compressed into a smaller number of districts to actually waste their collective strength. So instead of effectively controlling one district or more, what happens is you're drawn into a single district. So here's an example. We'll show you this example here. If map makers draw one district that is over 90% of a single minority group, so here this will be blue, when instead they could actually draw two districts each with 50% single minority group. And you see the differences how this plays out. One instance, you could have three districts where it's two gray, one blue. And so that means that those blue wards actually packed into one district. And so their voting power is specifically concentrated in one district. Whereas on the far right, you would actually see that their voting power would actually be proportionate to the makeup of their population. And so you'd actually be more representative. And so instead of having just one district, you actually have two districts and more representation, which means more opportunities to select your candidate of choice. So what is cracking? So this is probably the types of kind of the spreading or splitting apart of minority voters. So we talked about packing, which concentrates and compresses. Well, cracking ends up actually splitting or fracturing these voters into a bunch of different districts. And so what does this mean by an example? So if you have three districts and that there are 40% of a minority population in each district, what happens then is that you would be placed in a district in which you are 70%, so that you would actually, instead of being distributed out, what ends up happening is that you actually have no representation whatsoever. And so a proportional outcome here would be that you're split up into multiple districts and you at least get one district of representation. This is really critical, and we'll talk about majority minority districts here in a little bit, but this is really critical and important to think about why this is occurring. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act provides some protections against these mechanisms. So as amended in 1982, so what, again, as I told you, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, but there needed to be several amendments along the way to re-up different sections of the Voting Rights Act as we saw more patterns of discrimination happening, people trying to get away and do all sorts of loopholes to keep people from voting and enact more barriers. What ended up happening was Section 2 now says that any type of process, so whether it's, we're talking about, discriminated because of restrictive voter ID laws, for example, if it's particularly restrictive, or redistricting, which is part of the process. Any process that actually results in the abridgment of the right to vote on the account of voters' race, color, language, minority status is unlawful. And this is really important, whether or not an intent to discriminate can be proven. So the reason they needed to implement this amendment to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is because you had people who were getting discriminated against based on their race, color, language, or minority status, and yet they were not able to have claims and have relief for their claims because they couldn't prove intent. It's very difficult to prove. At times, it's very difficult to prove intent to discriminate. So unless you had a number of different ways in which someone maybe said something explicit, that they were explicitly discriminating, and then even in those circumstances, sometimes it was difficult to show intent to discriminate. And so this is critically important because what it showed then was that even the patterns and practices of a particular policy, it results in an abridgment of the right to vote. And so even whether or not that was intended, it actually resulted in discrimination. And so they had a claim for relief. And so other statutes that have been further, revised along with other Supreme Court precedents around this, actually ask a number of different questions. And the kind of quote here is totality of the circumstances to determine whether or not the challenge voting restriction has abridged on protected voters' ability to participate equally in elections and to elect representatives of their choice. This is critical in every sort of claim moving forward, especially as it relates to redistricting, because people have the opportunity for relief if they say that their right has been abridged upon. And so then they actually determine a number of different factors to see whether or not it's been abridged. Next slide. And so this has given rise to a number of claims. So vote dilution and vote deprivation, and even beyond just claims around based on racial status, but really beyond focusing on broader claims of discrimination, especially as it relates to equal protection. We talk a little bit about that, but we're going to get real complicated. So I don't want to go into all those details. But ultimately, these claims, these vote dilution claims say, it can happen both in redistricting, but also an at-large voting system. So something that I think the city of Columbus has to think about as we even talk about moving to redistricting with wards. However, still voting on in a totality at large could give rise, depending on different processes and how that moves forward, to these types of claims. So it's important to watch out for those types of claims and why we need to have an inclusive public engagement process. And of course, you have all the attorneys in the world to make sure that there's a process that ensures that we're upholding the laws here. But it's really important because there's a number of different complicated judicial doctrine around this, and several high-profile Supreme Court decisions that determine whether or not somebody was deprived of their right to vote. Next slide here. And we're almost done with all the legalese. No worries there. I know it's a lot. So one of the big cases when we talk about redistricting, and all of you are going to be hearing more and more about this, is Thornburg versus Gingles. This is a Supreme Court decision that actually reviewed, okay, what do you mean a totality of circumstances that might lead to a vote dilution claim? What does that even mean? And so there's a couple of different steps that they include as part of that. So one is the effective minority group is sufficiently large to elect a representative of its choice, right? So if they were to, they were large enough to say that they could be proportionate and they would vote and their selected candidate would move forward, that's an important aspect that you want to have. And then the second piece is the minority group is politically cohesive. So what that means is that they have similar voting patterns. So if they are going to vote for similar candidates and they are more likely, and if they had a large enough base to be able to vote and elect that representative, then that claim could show that potentially they're being deprived or abridged on their right to vote. However, this third factor is also important, which shows that the white majority voters actually vote sufficiently as a bloc to often defeat the minority group's preferred candidates. And the reason why it's kind of labeled as voting as a bloc and these types of things is because many cases and instances in communities across the country where you had these barriers, where you would have these potential opportunities for majority minority districts, but what ended up happening is we had additional barriers that kept them from voting. We'll talk about these majority minority districts on the next slide. So majority minority districts. So this is an opportunity, especially for those who haven't had the chance to elect representatives of their choosing. We actually, in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, actually provide certain criteria for the types of drawing of majority minority districts and why this is allowed. So one, as I mentioned, a group is sufficiently large and geographically concentrated in a way that they can actually make up the majority of the district. And so it would be proportionate to that district. And then, as mentioned before, the minority group is actually votes in similar patterns. So they might vote for the same candidates. Usually they measure this through a number of just the history in terms of voting in a particular community. And then, as I mentioned before, the white majority traditionally would vote together to defeat minority preferred candidates over time, even if they didn't make up the majority of the total district. And so what ends up happening is if all these factors come together, given the totality of circumstances, the minority group has less opportunity than other members of the electorate to actually participate in the electoral process and to elect representatives of their choice. And so their vote has been deprived and diluted. And so as a result, these protections in Section 2 help to protect against some of that. However, the next slide, you'll see why this is really important. So despite all these protections, some politicians continue to find ways to rig the system in their favor. That's why it's so important when we talk about public engagement, community engagement, to talk about these issues so that politicians are not picking their voters, right? Instead, it's actually up to voters to pick their politicians. And so we don't see the same opportunities to be rigged in the favor of those who are already in power and aren't looking to see the opportunities expanded for other communities. And unfortunately, these protections continue to get rolled back because of a major voting rights decision, Shelby v. Holder. Next slide. So this is a critical voting decision. Shelby v. Holder in 2013. This was a rollback of voting rights. And Shelby, the U.S. Supreme Court, struck down the key provision of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance coverage formula, as unconstitutional. So I mentioned this was Section 5, the coverage formula of the Voting Rights Act. And what this did then was it actually significantly undermined the Voting Rights Act because what happened was previously, instead of, if you were a jurisdiction that had to get pre-clearance because you had a pattern of voter discrimination and aggressive voter discrimination, you then you didn't have to get that pre-clearance anymore. And you talk about in this particular case, it was a split decision, but ultimately this was the decision that was made on the Supreme Court because in the dissent you had people saying, look, we still see patterns of discrimination, and unfortunately you're going to see that happen without this protection. The majority opinion in this case basically said that they're using old data from the 1960s and it doesn't apply today. And one of the really famous lines here around this in the dissenting opinion is, well, if it's raining and you get rid of your umbrella because you think you're not getting wet, that doesn't mean it stopped raining. And this is really an example of where we are, which is jurisdictions that had previously been covered by the coverage formula continued to actually implement systematic voter registration purges and other forms of voter suppression. And so, in the absence of strong federal enforcement of voting rights, states are actually rolling back voter protection efforts and making it harder to vote. And why is this important today? Well, since 2020 election alone, there have been more than 300 restrictive voting bills introduced across the country, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. And these are designed in different ways that would ultimately say, oh, well, we're just doing this under the guise of election security or voter fraud. And so we need to provide more protections like voter ID laws, or what we saw in Georgia, where we can't have people giving water to people waiting in line to vote, your food and water to people waiting in line to vote. And they're trying to make this as if it's some sort of partisan issue, when we actually know that a number of these laws have been a number of these bills have been passed into law and disproportionately impact communities of color. And this is why it's so critical for the community to talk about, if your right to vote is being abridged upon, you have the opportunity for relief based on the protections in the Voting Rights Act, but also other protections for democracy reforms to talk about these issues moving forward. And it's not just voting rights as it relates to voting at the ballot box. It's also voting rights as it relates to broader issues such as redistricting more broadly. And those last couple slides I'll show you here, you look and see 50 plus years after Selma, voting rights still matter. And voting rights now, a lot of people are still fighting for the right to vote and still continue to be disproportionately impacted. And we cannot ignore this, and it's occurring. And the next slide is a powerful quote that I'll leave you with from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Quote, voting is the language of American democracy. The ability to participate in civic life, to have a voice in the choosing the elected officials whose decisions impact our lives, our families, and communities is at the core of what it means to be American. These are critical. We want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to vote and everybody is represented. But we know that oftentimes, and sadly, even today, many of these rights are under attack. And so commissions like what we're doing here today, and especially if we have more public engagement, getting involved in broader redistricting efforts that are happening at the state level as well, and seeing what's happening across the country, seeing what groups like On the Line and others are doing to talk about these issues is critical to make sure we have engagement process. And we want to know the history of voting rights and why it's critical for where we are today. And that's all I have for my time. And I just want to thank you all for the opportunity. Thank you.
Kyle, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. A lot of good information, almost overwhelming amount of information. But I know that it's going to help myself and the commissioners as we think through the process. But with that, do you have any questions, commissioners? We do have one question.
Perfect.
Hi, Kyle. Thank you again for your presentation tonight. You know, what we're charged with is not going to be easy, you know, given the fact that, you know, the census data is going to be delayed. The fact that, you know, of course, we need to abide by the Voting Rights Act. We also have the requirement that the districts, sorry, I need to pull up the right wording so I get this right, that the districts must roughly be the same population size, with the largest district not exceeding the size of the smallest district by more than 1%. As we're thinking about data that, you know, we're, you know, pooling, kind of mapping out, you know, the Opportunity Index, I think, by the Kirwan Institute is a great, like, non-traditional data source. What other things should we be thinking about as, you know, we're collecting data?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you all have a very difficult task ahead in determining this. So one of the things that's important is, so there's a number of data sources that can be utilized. Obviously, as the census data comes in, and it's going to be coming in fast, but looking at how this also measures to other American Community Survey data, looking at the process of those 5-year estimates, because we know that. Sadly, unfortunately, even the census data is not going to be the data that is exactly precise. And so those are going to be a number of different factors that we're going to have to think about. The good thing here is that there's going to be a number of different steps for guidance that both the census, but also other officials around redistricting will be considering in this particular instance. Unfortunately, I can't give any specifics yet. Because I don't know exactly what the process is going to look like as the data comes in. But I'm more than happy to help support as you all think through these different types of data sources. And that's always one of the big things that we know when we do the research that we do, is that, like, this data is often not always inclusive, especially of those who've been consistently marginalized. But that's the data that we have. And so how do you use additional data sources that will then be in compliance with the various laws? And so I hope that some of the guidance that will be initiated at the federal level will be helpful in terms of making some of those determinations. But we'll see a little closer when we get to the date.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions? Cool. Well, hearing none, Kyle, thank you so much for your time. And we likely will engage your team again as we are thinking about other data. And I know that you all have a huge and do a great important work. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Next up, we have Doreen on the. Hey, thanks, Kyle. Next, we will hear from Doreen on the history of Columbus. Doreen, thank you for joining us this evening.
Is to sort of give you the almost a prequel to Star Wars here. I'm going back into more of the history of Columbus and how neighborhoods have developed. And in this interview of this overview of it, I was going to say that it's not exactly the 30,000 foot level. It's more like looking at neighbors in Columbus from the moon. So it's going to be very broad and very general, with opportunities to try to throw a few examples in as to how this is still affecting things today. But I look forward to being able to answer questions about various parts of the city in more detail as you may come upon them later. So let's start with the next slide. I think when we think about neighborhoods, there are geographic areas that reflect certain values. There is a quality of life value, how a neighborhood defines itself, what it values is whether it's dealing with the urban canopy of trees, or it is with institutions that meet the needs of the citizens. It's with schools that are essentially of the neighborhood, which is a long since disproportionate way of saying that neighborhoods and school districts rarely go together. A sense of community spirit, some other types of other intangibles, including what might seem like a sort of an idiosyncratic term, consistent zoning, but zoning that makes sense in some ways to us, that as it would have been reflected supposedly in the 1920s when zoning came to Columbus as it did to much of the country. Okay, next slide. But the problem with looking at an actual definition for neighborhoods is that the genesis of neighborhoods, especially in Columbus, is like looking at an old photograph with you see order and purpose, but you actually don't know what the story is behind it. And I took this picture specifically to put in the screen because this is German Village, and this is German Village probably just after the Civil War, and you couldn't have a much more explicit photo of order and purpose than this idea of the orderly yard, the fences that are there that define the property, the boundary, the woman with her arms around the children and the children dressed in a sense of decorum and a sense of gentility. And yet the interesting thing is about the entire German experience is that there are so many myths that emerge later about that largest ethnic immigration in the 19th century as a European influence, which was the German community, that will point these out a little bit later, that this picture is not exactly all that it seems. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So it's not the case. Neighborhoods evolve historically and organically with a number of factors that create unique situations we still see today. Kind of as Kyle intimated, what you really have to do is look at neighborhoods as through a filter of migration, immigration, industrialization, and other factors which are going to affect neighborhoods, including, oddly enough, things like popular culture. One of the things that most affect us as to how we look at neighborhoods, if we are in any way embedded within that neighborhood for a period of time, or talk to our neighbors about what they perceive to be the history of neighborhoods, is that we really only have a history of neighborhoods that is about 3 generations in length. I believe how I grew up because of how my parents reacted to what their influences were in the city of Cleveland and what they brought to that. And they came with very different immigrant and coal mining experiences. If I was lucky, I would have known my grandparents. Today, we may have 4 generations. In other words, we really don't ever teach the history of a locale to people, much less through a filter of national policies. And so in trying to pick apart and research various neighborhoods, there are 1,000 stories in the naked city. And we need to be very careful as to how we do that, because as Kyle said, this is not about the failure or the success of a group of people. This is more about how we are impacted by environmental and government policies that have come down to the local level. Okay, the next slide. So one way to do this is for a very quick overview, the complexity of what we're with. And one of the reasons I chose it this way is because you will see that we already have a very complex situation in Columbus where a lot of the identity of neighborhoods is taken from pre-existing commissions, civic associations. 21 civic associations I chair the University District area, and it is the oldest area commission born out of the student unrest at Ohio State into the neighborhoods, into the city of Columbus. And out of that came the first idea of an area commission. And so after that, including the historic districts, all start to fall into sort of a pattern within this, from the 70s through the 90s. So the next one, the 21 area commissions, and then we have the next slide, which is a listing of all of them. I'm sure you're familiar. There are 26 official historic neighborhoods in the city, meaning that these are looked at as being under various umbrellas, whether it's the Historic Resources Commission or whether it's a National Register, and we'll just go through these very quickly. So next slide. So for instance, these 5 in the last slide were the ones that are under the Historic Resources Commission. The next group is those neighborhoods that are historic in the sense that they are both on the Columbus City Register and the National Register of Historic Places. And if you're not familiar with the difference, I'll tell you that in just a moment. And the next slide. 5 historic districts on the Columbus City Register of Historic Places. These, for instance, do not have a separate district as does German Village or Italian Village. But Old Oaks, Indianola Forest, Bryden Road, Northwood Park, and New Indianola, which is one small part of Wyland Park, are actually all under the HRC, the Historic Resources Commission. So cases that come up individually are dealt with that way. And then we have the 9 historic districts that are just on the National Register of Historic Places. And the first one I think is very interesting because sometimes it will turn up Hanford Village as a ghost town. Hanford Village still does exist. Hanford Village was basically a white railroad node for farmers that is over by the Nelson Road with the very large grain mills that you can still see. But in the 1940s, the George Washington Carver Edition was created out of federal money to provide housing for African American airmen who were at Lockbourne, who could not find any place to live. And it was done in the late 40s. It was designed actually by a New York architect. And so it has somewhat of a separate history. It's a very interesting community in the sense that there are parts of it that still exist as part of an industrial and rural base, and others that are a very orderly little neighborhood in which we're probably now in the 3rd generation of the grandchildren who own some of the houses, and only now is it somewhat turning over. Each of these areas has its own sort of little unique history. 2 of them are commercial areas. One is Old North Columbus, which is around Arcadia and High Street. It's a shared historic node, let's put it that way, between University and Clintonville. And another commercial node would be, well, I guess I would say North High and the Gay Street area. Not all of Gay Street is on it. And yet there are other parts here which are, for instance, the near North Side is a very old designation on the National Register. And it would have been the original federal recognition of Victorian Village and about 4 blocks into the University District. So all of these, again, help to build the identity of what people see as their neighborhood. So the next slide. So, and in addition to that, I mention this because for many neighborhoods, the history of the neighborhood is reflected in the individual property, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, the National Register of Historic Places does not save a building if there was a call for demolition. The city register, however, is a regulatory body under the city of Columbus, which helps not just to promote that historic district and protect it, but in which, if it were in a neighborhood, the homeowners have agreed that they will in fact follow certain guidelines in both their architecture and their landscaping, not the interior of the property. A National Register property, as much as you may love it, care for it, or think it's important, the usual joke in the preservation world is that just keep the screwdriver handy when the bulldozers come to unscrew the historic plaque. It does not protect you in any way. It can, however, lead to a community or a neighborhood wishing to have that more protection and apply for a city register. So we'll go to the next slide. And to boot, there are 305 civic associations, and that is probably a very low number, to be honest. And civic associations can certainly range in terms of both neighborhood or business associations that cross boundaries into both. They can be as large and probably as well known as the Northland Civic Association, and as small as at a street level. Whereas the Area Commission is actually part of city code, and it's defined by city code, and its duties are by city code. Its bylaws are approved by the city attorney, and it must follow all sunshine laws. Civic associations do not. They can certainly be a beneficial organization and work together well and bring about change, but they are not really governed in quite the same way. All of this means that people feel deeply about neighborhoods. And we're going to go on to the next slide and try to drill down a little bit more. So how did this all evolve? And what's kind of odd is that the map that I've chosen to use for you here is one that is purposely sort of oddball. This is actually not a map that the Kirwan Institute would put out. This was an artist's conception of what Columbus looks like by neighborhood, and how the artist decided it was as north as Clintonville and as south as German Village, and nobody else counted. It's sort of interesting. Of course, I kind of liked it because it put the University District in the center. But on the other hand, it is a little bit odd but troublesome when you see that there's Upper Arlington and Grandview on it. And this brings up an interesting thing, and it has to do with branding. Just like the term short north, we don't seem to use Italian Village or Victorian Village as much anymore. Now it's short north. That branding has started to overshadow what had been traditional neighborhoods of Columbus. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, except that think about what I just told you about 305 civic associations. There is a tendency to want to go smaller, not larger. And you're going to be tasked with essentially going larger in the sense of where do things sort of morph into, what goes with what, all of the logistics of just being everything that was implied and spoken very clearly by Kyle about the voting rights really comes down in some cases to something that's much harder to get at, and that is how people actually feel and what they know about their own neighborhood. So there is a tendency to go to the microcosm, not the macrocosm, and a tendency to blend where need be. Grandview is an interesting case because most of Grandview was actually is in Columbus to a great extent. And in fact, the term Grandview is now just being branded everywhere in that area because it has a certain cachet. The university area has long suffered from, I feel sometimes like I work a lot in Eastern Europe, like the university district is a lot like Ukraine. We have questions on either end of borders. If the houses are very nice in Glen Echo, real estate people tend to say they're in Clintonville. If the houses are just getting just wonderful and we're into the circles in Denison Place, then we're in Victorian Village. No, we're in the university district. Long ago, I stopped with the border wars. I just find it somewhat amusing now, but it won't be amusing if indeed people feel very personally as if they have been devalued. So let's go back to the history in the next slide. So we'll stay on the slide for just a little bit. This is certainly not the definitive neighborhoods of the North Side, but one of the tendencies in Columbus, which I think is very interesting that most of you will recognize, is people who live north always live north. People who live east, west siders stay on the west side, and south enders stay on the south end. And so after a while, you start to think about, if I don't really know that part of the city. I mean, I could drive through the short north or I can stay on major freeways, but where in the heck are some of the rest of these things? And unless you have gone to Ohio State, you may not even know some of the neighborhoods that are mentioned in here. But already we have this interesting dichotomy I'll get into a little bit later, because you see things that are as far away as San Margarita on one end of the spectrum over by the quarries. You find another neighborhood that is like Linden, which seems to be on the far side of the Boone if you're on the other side of the freeway. You have the Peach District, which we continually kid. We have no idea how it got that name, except it needed a name, and suddenly that popped up. And the history of Milo, Grogan, and Linden, which I know very well from working with Columbus school students at Fort Hays about the history of that area, becomes a very interesting piece to note, because it is almost like the escape valve for what happens under deep times of segregation in the history of our country and in the history of the city. Each of these has its own peculiar and sometimes contradictory history. And we can just try to pull a few of them out and give you some ideas at some point. Let's go on to the next slide. The neighborhoods of the South Side were definitely impacted by migration, immigration, and industrialization, and by what happened with the townships. If you think about an old map of Columbus, and I'm sure even looking at a new one, you've noticed too, that the shape of Columbus is a little bit like a Maltese cross, very definite north-south and east-west. And somewhere in sort of the sleeves of each of those four directions are townships that continue to this day. And the townships really are impacted by the city, but also have their way of impacting the city to a degree that is perhaps not easily perceived. So when I mentioned before about the North End was the closest historically to Worthington. And Worthington probably would have been, in the early 19th century, our nearest other urban, hardly urban neighbor. And so it would have been very normal for the lines of paths, which are basically old buffalo trails and stagecoach lines and later streetcar lines, to go north. The expansion of the city would be between the downtown and Worthington. In fact, Old North Columbus, which is that shared historic boundary in a way between Clintonville and the university area, is almost exactly halfway between them and was a stagecoach stop. But the growth north also was owned, the land was owned by huge landlords, most of which could be summed up as the Neal family. The Neals, the Deschlers, and some of the others were definitely people who were cash poor but land rich. And so when it came time by the 1870s and after the Civil War, and William Neal, who owned everything the Ohio State Fairgrounds is on, Ohio State University is on, most of the north side, including, everything from Fifth Avenue to the north. By the time he died and it was left to the first generation of heirs, a larger institution, which is going to grow like Ohio State as the Ohio Agricultural Mechanical College, it's only natural to be there. The Ohio Fairgrounds will be there. And those will start to determine also various patterns. Whereas in the South Side, what's happening is that the townships really rule. They do not come into the city. And by the Civil War, the industry that was once located in the downtown finds that the real estate is really too expensive to stay there. They need to leave and they need to spread out from the city. I'll give you an example of that. I think most of us are familiar with pictures of the city of Columbus before the 1913 flood, where the downtown, the riverfront area is very industrial, very blighted. It is really a tragedy, shameful. It's also the start of some of the oldest of the neighborhoods that morph into other things like Flytown into a Victorian village. But right at the site of City Hall was a Hayden Ironworks. The Hayden Ironworks was an enormous factory that was so large that it was colloquially, referred to as Birmingham. And Birmingham in Alabama was known for the ironworks it produced. Birmingham was also not a term of compliment, let's put it that way. Birmingham became sort of the center of using what Hassan Jeffries calls, another form of slavery. It was essentially all of the prison labor in Southern prisoners, African-American men who were forced to work in the swamps, dragging out the petrified wood all through the South, which burned at a hotter temperature to fire the ironworks. Peter Hayden, who starts this, has already come from the East Coast to build. He's come as a wealthy man. He is already building upon this because on the south side of town, what does he find? A nexus of railroads. He finds the beginning places of industry and the closest access to the natural resources of the south side, which are all going to make the the Gilded Age of Columbus after the Civil War, which is also the start of the most controversial in terms of racially divided politics Ohio will experience. There has been no reconciliation of Reconstruction. And Columbus is, if nothing else, when we talk about the fourth direction, is very much of a southern town. So some of these neighborhoods, and let me point out just very quickly, German Village is inhabited already by 1812 by Germans. Some of the first 12 families are German. They don't come in as farmers. They come in as businessmen and entrepreneurs, people who want to start their own business. By 1840, they will grow, but they will stay basically south of town because the land is cheaper. Anytime you are downriver, you are dealing with cheaper land, and it was an economical factor. In the 1840s, there is documented evidence of Germans who are arriving at basically where the convention center is today and trekking down High Street to settle in with other like-minded and German-speaking people. And German language, by the way, is the only thing at this time that unites German people, because it is not even yet a country in Europe that has definite geographic boundaries. And on their way down, they actually pass a group of Shawnee who are coming north to get onto trains that will take them to Kansas City, where they have been exiled. And in fact, Shawnee Hills in Kansas is a direct relationship to German Village. South of German Village is an area that will come in as Hungarian Village, where 42% of the ethnic groups that are in the area that are working in what will be the factories and foundries, Buckeye Steel, some of the other glass factories, a number of things that grow out of that, they will make up 42% of what will be mostly Central and Eastern European. So each of these areas have different backgrounds. Reeb Hosack, sometimes called the Steelton, which was the nickname for the Old South Side. Reeb Hosack is a little bit different. It will come in as practically two streets in which the only housing that Buckeye Steel gave for its employees was to African Americans, many of whom they had recruited from Alabama, just as Marble Cliff was recruiting Alabama men to work in the most dangerous jobs of blasting in the quarries. And they stayed in Columbus during the summers because the pay was better, and actually the conditions, even though they lived in railroad cars, were less arduous than being in the South, but they could go home with a much better collection of money for the family. And so we have these patterns emerging, and out of this will become other things, including a lot of discriminating clauses in contracts, which by far predate redlining. So let's move on to the next slide. And the east sides of town tend to be the older sides in Midwestern cities because they were first settled. There was always this myth that people wanted to live, if you were rich and famous, on the east side, because you it was a strange one. You wanted to wake up in the morning to the sun on, one side of town, the east side, and go home on the west side with the sun to your back. I doubt very seriously if that's why anybody ever moved on the east side, but it was the first area of settlement. So that places like Bryden Road and Old Town East and the Driving Park, which was basically a Jewish neighborhood, and that's a very different pattern because when the synagogue moved and the Jewish community moved further east to be together, that has a very different pattern after having studied multiple listing service cards for all of these people and real estate cards from 1950 to 1970s. That is almost a migration in and of itself. But Broad Street, of course, becomes, an area of mansions. But what cuts across this, which is not as easily perceived, is Taylor Station, which is part of the refugee tract. Refugee Road is the southern boundary, and Fifth Avenue is the northern boundary. And that was land that was set aside for refugees after the American Revolution, who were from Canadians or Nova Scotians who had sided with the American Revolution and were burned out of their homes by the British, received allotments of land after the American Revolution in Ohio, right through the center of Columbus. And some of them took them up, like the Taylor family. Others sold their land and eventually Some of the land would be sold to other people. Germans started buying and others, whatnot, giving the East Side a far different makeup, culture, and socioeconomic background. It is an old German, Jewish, and African American communities that are dotted in and around on the East Side. What happens to Mount Vernon and Longstreet and what we know is this King Lincoln, Bronzeville, and King Lincoln is a government term, whereas Bronzeville is a historic term. Columbus was only one of 3 communities that had the model of a Bronzeville, had started actually the model of Bronzeville to mirror the city government in order to provide sort of a mayor as a spokesperson, various city departments who could interact with the white city for the most part of the city council. And so today those 3 words are often run together, but know that there is a difference between them. But what starts to happen is we can easily document that there were 22 to 24, if not more, early African American settlements in Columbus and Central Ohio. And they exist in the little townships. They exist here or there. Quite honestly, not everybody in the world on the Underground Railroad goes either north or east. Of course, if you were south, you went south, further south, often down into the tip of Florida, or even west into Texas. But a lot of people who are crossing the Ohio River are actually hunkering down in place. And I'll get to an example of that in a moment. But the largest concentration of African American population tends to be historically on the East Side, generally on the streets in between the streets where the mansions are, because in pre-Civil War Columbus, rich and poor lived in close proximity because that was the work relationship between people. Your laundry person, your carpenter, they lived a street or 2 behind you if you owned the big house on Town Street. So when segregated clauses start coming in with developers and streetcar suburbs, a lot of the concentration becomes even denser. In fact, the whole argument for a Poindexter Village, which is the federal housing project in the 1940s, so honored in Columbus for its unique history, actually is originally designed to attract all of the African Americans in the Columbus area and to pull them out of these other areas. We are now sort of the making of a very fragile area, rich in people, rich in a lot of the resources that the community could build, but definitely hemmed in. And Cleveland Avenue, right up past Fort Hayes and through an area called the Badlands, will go on up into Milo and into Linden, will be one of the only escape valves for where people can find other housing, unless, of course, they stay in these little enclaves. So these neighborhoods, even if they're geographically have similarities, they too will be different. So the next slide may give a little bit better example of this. The West Side is probably the most diverse in some areas, and yet has some forgotten past. Franklinton, 1797, is the old neighborhood where this is the original piece of land, and it's not a small piece of land. Lucas Sullivan, who is doing surveying work, lays out the town of Franklinton, and he can claim land for his own payment, and it's 1,000 acres. And it is literally at the base of the hilltop, what we call the hilltop today. It is in the bottoms. It is the flat land. It is subject to periodic flooding, and it has always been this way. And if you ask people in the 19th century, why didn't they move to the other side of the river to where the State House would be? They would say it's because of the wolves that are up there. They traded in the periodic flooding, which made at least for good farming if it wasn't drastic. And they lived on the west side because they were really, truly afraid of the dense forest and the wolves on the other side, the east side. And that was long before I could always use my usual joke that it was not the wolf family of the Dispatch fame that terrified them. These were real wolves. But what comes with this west side is, of course, the 1913 flood. And at that point, the hilltop will start absorbing quite a few of the really refugees. And by the 1920s, Westgate, of course, is forming as a streetcar suburb. And Lincoln Village is something completely different as the Galbraith Project, which comes in with very heavy segregation policies. Valley View stays out of that until they're sort of taken over by interlocking agreements with the city and needs that make municipal services and or school districts. Briggsdale is even further out. The one that's not mentioned that I do want to mention, though, is Burnside Heights, which most people don't even know still exists, Sullivan and Demarest, in what had been essentially the old Quaker community, a sort of a nexus of Quaker families. On the west side, 4 miles out, was the Camp Chase, which was a Civil War camp that turned into a prisoner of war camp. It is the largest Confederate cemetery, largest Confederate prisoner of war camp that was north of the Mason-Dixon line. And in that nexus of prisoners who were brought in from the Confederacy were very high-ranking generals and down to privates. But some of the ones who came in there came with body servants who were essentially still slaves. And in fact, the history of it is that Columbus, upon about 2 years into the Civil War, when those conditions became very bad at Camp Chase, and it was apparent through dysentery and cholera, there were multiple deaths, which is the result of the little cemetery that is still there today, that there were, in fact, about 100 men who were there because they were still serving a white master. Whether it was a choice that they made, they wanted to go with the young boy that they had, were familiar with the family, or they were told to. The stories are all different, but they form Burnside Heights. Burnside Heights is on the other side of Sullivan. And as you can imagine, in the 1860s, suddenly there is a federal proclamation inspired by the people of Columbus, who are, for the most part, ardent abolitionists, even if the State House at that time certainly still was not. And they petitioned to have those men freed. Where do you go and how do you get there? And would you ever live to tell about it? They almost literally walk across the road, which will be Sullivan, and settle into a field and that was owned by someone who had bought it from one of the Sullivan boys. Michael Sullivan was one of the sons of Lucas, who allowed them to squat there and to farm. At various times, they'll pull up bricks from the streets and make houses out of them. There's very little left of the fabric, but people know the street, and they know kind of a little bit about that history, at least African Americans who live on the west side. By the way, only generally in 3 pockets, and Burnside being one of them. But what they will know is that it was the home of Nancy Wilson, who is very famous in Columbus history, whose father worked at Jeffrey on the north side of town because he could not buy a house or even rent a house anywhere in the area. Milo, that part of Linden, were all restricted to Caucasians. And I want to stress that when you look at old deeds and you look at restrictive covenants and things, sometimes they will say whites only, sometimes they will say Caucasians only. Rarely do they say, although by the 20s they start to say simply just no African Americans, no blacks. That according to the US policies and race policies and the theory of race all the way through the 20s, and certainly capitalized by the Ku Klux Klan and others, is that the Jews, Italians, and African Americans are all non-white. And so this Briggsdale has this interesting history. The other 2 places have also interesting history. One of them will be sort of at the crest of the hill where St. Aloysius is because of that refugee population from the flooding, and also because they were hired at one of the larger state institutions that were there with the mental health facilities. But the third will be in a small area behind where the state institutions were. And they are people who flee for their lives in the middle of the night, not once, but twice, but 3 times over a period of 4 years from the Springfield race riots. If you go all the way out the National Road and you go out Route 40, you are very quickly in Springfield. And the railroads which brought commerce to Columbus and certainly riches also were famous for essentially throwing African American men off their jobs in order to knuckle under pressure to hire white workers. And if that didn't work efficiently enough, there were often race riots started in what would be considered the bad side of town, purposely so that there would be lynch mobs and there would be violence. And we're talking 1904, 1906, 1908. And people fled for their lives to Columbus and settled where they could, where maybe they knew another family who was employed there, and a small node forms there. So each of these four sides of town on the surface looks to be about the same, but in reality, each of them have a very different story. Just one more little piece about, well, let's go to the next slide, and I think that may be more helpful actually. So these settlement patterns, these migrations and immigrations are going to determine Columbus neighborhoods. And the slide up there is something that most people don't realize. And this was the Chinese Merchants Association. There was an entire enclave, just like in other cities, in Cleveland and Chicago, New York, and other places, there was a small Chinese enclave, usually closer to where the Cultural Arts Center is today on Mound Street, and then even onto the west side. This building was demolished by the 1950s. It was a substantial community. It was serving the needs of a lot of the restaurants and other kinds of occupations that you see almost every nationality and ethnic group at some point in their assimilation open restaurants, laundries, service facilities where language will not be such a problem and they can start to thrive and put their children in school. And so Columbus did also have this. By the way, in World War II, Columbus has over 45 Chinese laundries, very proudly proclaiming that because they didn't want to be considered alien enemies with Japanese. And so they proudly displayed their banners and also wore small pins to distinguish themselves. But we're talking about a population whose now is very hard historically to trace, but is definitely within the memory of generations. Okay, on to the next one. And this is the slide I thought might help a little bit more. Actually, we may have skipped one, but could we back up one slide? No, I guess not. Go ahead, before it'll pop up later. This was sort of an oddball map, and oh, thank you. That's the one I'm looking for, and then we'll go back. So the early settlement patterns that were determined by the U.S. government are actually what determines neighborhoods. So you see this segment off to the side, that's refugee track. That was what I just mentioned. Those went to Nova Scotians and Canadians. Those who didn't arrive later sold their land. Anything labeled as the U.S. military district was different than what would be measured on the west side, which are the Virginia military lands, which are in the lower left-hand corner. And those went to Kentucky and Virginians, like, for instance, the Sullivan family, who are doing all of that. And then the Congress lands are also divided for yet another group. So the middle colony groups. So you can actually, still on a map today, figure out where people came. Worthington are New Englanders. They're coming out of the Western Reserve. They're coming out of Connecticut. They're highly abolitionists, very much Presbyterians, I guess, in the early days. They form in fact, if you look at 161 in North High Street, there are 4 little pasture lands. That is about as New England as you can get for a town square. And then you go down into Columbus, where the State House is, and it's one big square, and that's very Virginia. It sits right there for all to see how the land was actually used. Coming in from the middle colonies, from Pennsylvania and New York, will come in from the east side, but more the northeast side, which is Mifflin Township. And Mifflin was the governor, named for the governor of Pennsylvania. And you can find this throughout all of the names. You can start to figure out pieces of things. But when I mentioned that Columbus is really a very southern town, in 1950, a trained linguist who had an ear for dialect could stand on the corner, broad and high, and ask 100 people to say one word, P-U-S-H. And if they said push or push, kind of a little softer sound, or some variation of that, they could tell you what side of town you were born on. Were you born north of Broad Street or south, east of High Street or west of High Street? Broad and high became known in linguistic textbooks as an isinglass, an actual physical boundary which determined a dialectic change. They're rather rare when you can get down to that level of specificity, but Columbus did have one. And you could still do this in the 1950s. Columbus was seen as a southern town, and it had divided loyalties, even in the Civil War. The whole idea of the southern gentility, however, is often far removed from the roots of the Northwest Ordinance, which should not permit slavery. So you do find some families who come in with African American, free African American, whether they're retainers, whether they're servants, whatever the relationship is, whether it's a closer household relationship. It's sometimes a little bit hard to decipher. As a board member of Green Lawn Cemetery, we're embarked on a very large project right now in terms of trying to figure out African American burial patterns and ones that were moved into the cemetery from the North Graveyard and whatnot. And so this is not just ancient history. This is still very relevant today because African Americans by city code, if they were buried in the North Graveyard, which is basically the North Market, and by the way, they're still under the pavement and will be when the North Market project goes on. You will hear more about burials being found. They were by the actual city language to be treated as strangers, as if they were a man who died on a train somewhere with no known identification in them and happened to be in Columbus and needed to be buried in Columbus. That's a stranger. But that is also how sometimes African Americans, which are a very old portion of the Columbus population, would be treated. After the Civil War, as I mentioned before, it's as if you would have never known we were a state that advocated or liked to have the romantic notion of full participation in the Underground Railroad, or were wildly abolitionist. That was not simply true at all. And so what you start to find is that although the hotels in downtown Columbus, and this will affect the neighborhoods in a moment, you'll see what I'm getting at, the hotels downtown employed African American men because they came generally from Virginia. Remember, there's no West Virginia until the Civil War, after the Civil War. And they were known for their gentility, for their training, for their plantation manners. I suppose that if they didn't know them, they learned quickly because that was what the hotels demanded, who did not pay them a salary, but gave them a uniform and allowed them to work on tips. And so whether they were, the person who took your bag, or they escorted you to the room, or they were waited on you in a dining room, this idea of the Southern gentility would be starting to be replaced by 1900 by waves of Central and Eastern Europeans that are coming in, and girls especially, who most kids who were working class kids were lucky to make it to the 8th grade. There was no thought of high school for them. And so boys could enter into apprenticeships, and boys could enter into kind of a internship in some way. But girls were put into hotel work, thereby sending the African American men back home. They were out of work for the next immigrant group coming in. So let's turn to the next slide, or I guess it's back one slide. Thank you. So although this map is hard to read, I've left it this purposely raw. And if you were my students, I would give you a set of colored pencils and say, go at it, to try to find, as you see in the little legend down below, essentially the industrial areas, the German neighborhood, of course, with my own vision problem here, scattered Negro families, solid Negro settlers, Jewish sections, Italian sections, and Romanian section. And at some point, you probably just said Romanian. If you notice that the map is 1918, this is part of a study that became very famous in the United States, and it's hard to actually find an original copy, but it came actually with Ohio State. It was a study, a PhD study, on comparison of two neighborhoods, one in the university area, which would have been the preeminent neighborhood in 1918, which is the same year Arlington is being founded, but the faculty and others who lived around the university have not moved across the river, and the Bottoms, the Franklinton area. And so this was an attempt to sort of show where everybody is. And the Romanian in 1918 were Hungarian-speaking parts of Transylvania, which has always been battered about. Sometimes it's sometimes it's Romania, sometimes it's Hungary. When I arrived in Columbus from Cleveland in the 1960s, my mother was Hungarian. I was invited to join a Hungarian cultural group, most of whom probably still had their roots in the southern part of Columbus and some of these areas. It was still a hotbed of contest, and you couldn't say the word Romanian in this cultural group. Fortunately, that's all past now. But what you start to see are some of, and then we found so many more when we had a report for the National Trust, that we did a report for the National Trust on early African American settlements. You start to see that these settlements take place in various parts around. Some are remnants of the Underground Railroad that doesn't go to Lake Erie. Some of them are because of the physical geography of Ohio, of Columbus, Ohio, which makes it not particularly adaptable for a lot of people who don't want it. It is too soggy, too swampy. We have artesian wells everywhere. The most western end of 11th Avenue on the river, near the river, which once had the OSU airport right on the other side of the river. That was a small African-American settlement. There are two settlements, one in Hilliard and one in Dublin, both known as mud socks for the muddy roads that the mud would dry on the horses' knees as they slogged through the mud, and then they would look like they had muddy socks on. For some of you, you may be more familiar with this because in the last 2 years, the Litchford farm of 400 acres owned by African-American family and employing probably 40 or 50 people, who later is the cemetery on which the Upper Arlington football field is now located, become reburied in the 1950s in Union Cemetery. And the Litchford built quite a foundation because the grandson will build one of the finest African-American hotels in Columbus, the Litchford Hotel on North 4th Street. These are all various different stories, and they deal with the neighborhoods formed. They are still in some ways exactly what this map is, and that is really amazing. So let's go to the next slide. And that brings in the physical geographic differences. When you think about it, Franklinton and Grandview are neighbors. And what divides them is one is on a big hill, the Grandview, and the other one is on a floodplain. And then to boot, as I said, clay pits, artesian wells. We are located on a plateau, actually of glacier moraines, which actually makes drilling impossible. There are places in Columbus, as an environmental lawyer will tell you, that you might as well be in Manhattan because it is solid rock all the way down. Let's go on to the next slide. And I'll try to rush through this a little bit. So part of what our patterns of neighborhoods actually follow, you would think you're looking at a road map. These are buffalo trails and Indian trails. We are walking in the same path that people did to portage canoes. And in fact, what's interesting is so near the very top of the map of Ohio is, and you may have noticed this when you travel 71, is the marcation of the watershed of Ohio. Virtually everything close to Lake Erie drains south, not into Lake Erie. That does make for interesting geographical or physical changes. You may have noticed that the ravines in Columbus only come on this one side of the Olentangy River, whereas the quarries, which are the building blocks of Ohio State and the downtown buildings, come from the other side of the Scioto. Okay, next slide. So the transportation routes are going to mirror exactly what has been started with both the railroad lines and the Indian trails, and many times they'll follow the riverbeds, which, because it's flatter, It will just exacerbate all of the flooding that Columbus has traditionally had, but they will determine the socioeconomic differences in segregation policies. Okay, if we turn one more slide. And this again is railroads. So let's go on to the next slide. This is the big determiner in Columbus. This is a streetcar map. I can tell you right now that we could travel this streetcar map and I could show you every deed restriction that a developer laid on the major corridors, east, west, south, and north. My husband kids me that I have the largest collection of restrictive covenants and discriminatory advertisement. And this is all prior to redlining. This is as early as 1912. This is even perhaps a little earlier than that. And every one of those railroad lines is eked out because it's going to be a growth that developers will then swoop in, buy whole areas, and slap the deed restriction on. Okay. And at the ends of these lines, by the way, that's where you get Minerva Park, are amusement parks, which help to determine how far out you are at certain times. Olentangy, Indianola, which is at North 4th and 17th Avenue, Minerva, which is out toward Westerville, which is now the neighborhood of Minerva Park. Okay, let's go on. It will be the same thing when the freeways come in, which you're looking at across the center. It's the spaghetti surrounding Parsons Avenue. These will become the highway acts that are determined after World War II that will become essentially escape routes in case of an atomic war. They were not really purposely designed, as many people think, so that people can get to the suburbs faster. But in large part, they determine where the suburbs will be because of the transportation models. They will, in some cases, decimate neighborhoods. The Near East Side will be cut off. The Mount Vernon and Longstreet area will be cut off. But what's also interesting, and I'll show you on the slide later, there's a kind of a backstory to that. This will definitely wipe out the old Jewish neighborhoods, and the Jewish population will move further east because the synagogues move east. Let's turn to the next one. This is the slide I was thinking of, and that is, this is actually 71 coming in, and you can see it's crossing Main and Brighton and everything else. On the right-hand side would be essentially some of the older neighborhoods and also some of the African-American neighborhoods, which were at that point really hemmed in, not allowed to move anywhere else. On the other side, on the left-hand side of the screen, a good example is Town Street. The people who still had the older money in that area, these were the family homes, put up a real fight not to have this. They kept moving it further to the African-American neighborhoods and away from being decimated. But the one thing they said was, we do not want to see, we don't want to see a freeway, we don't want to hear a freeway. And if you travel 71, it is the only place where the freeway dips below the horizon. And if you go up to 71, up to the Northland area, you will see nothing but the sound barricades. And a lot of that is Galbraith. Let's go to the next slide. Is the Galbraith World War II housing for GIs, which, by the way, African-American families couldn't get. Okay, next slide, whatever comes up. I think I remember this one. Annexations will also start earlier. It is not just Mayor Sensenbrenner in the 1950s. Christopher Columbus, there he is again. Whether we like him or not, he seems to either be pointing to something or championing something or the symbol of the city. He's pointing to Milo Grogan. Behind him at his elbow on the other side is West Columbus, and behind him is the south side. 1912-13, the city is devoid of money. The constant plan is we need sewers, and we need sewers especially in what would have been the oldest part, the older German settlement closest to downtown, which of course would not be German village yet, so I won't use that term. The city wanted these annexations because they wanted to be able to increase the tax base. Unfortunately, after the citizens of Milo Grogan did vote for this, and it went back and forth, as did other communities, they were annexed because zoning is going to come in within 8 years here. The zoning will determine these are industrial sites, thereby completely eliminating any residential quality of life, or even don't even ask for quality of life issues. You're a worker, you're going to live close to where you are, that's fine. But in essence, Hanford, Milo Grogan, a number of communities were sold a bill of goods early on so that the city coffers could be constantly maneuvered. Next slide. On Parsons Avenue, it will be the same thing. The dates on this at the top of the screen, the dark line represents Livingston Avenue. So you have some idea of everything south of Livingston. But the different dates, they're all over the place. They're 1850, 1840. But the more you head into the right-hand corner, the newer they get. What the townships had learned was, if we no longer play ball with you, and we give industry, who is desperately looking for places to be, we give them the better, we don't even charge them taxes. We won't tax them at all, because we'll be able to make up the money on the housing and other things that'll come in. The neighborhoods are definitely not even at times in Columbus, or they get annexed into Columbus for residential, but the tax base is going to the townships. And that is why this area became, the factory area became known as Smoky Row, because of the density of the fog and the smoke and the steel industries of the South Side, and all of the immigrant groups that come in. And by the way, the second wave of Germans that come in are prefer to be called Saxons. And so we have Saxons, Croatians, Hungarians, who make up 42% of that immigrant population. The African Americans who were coming in from Alabama, and we have some Polish. We have a foreign grocery where if you were an employee, you were expected to speak at least 7 languages, and it was open 24/7. And this is pre-World War I. It was quite the heart of Columbus, but a world which is definitely strange to the other 3 directions the city was expanding in. Okay, and next. So part of my collection of restrictive clauses, this is going up Cleveland Avenue. Again, Central Market was decimated, and there is a whole other story about Central Market. Love it or hate it, the city promised that they would save it. The Chicago consultants promised that it should be rebuilt if it had to be moved. It shouldn't be at North 4th and Main, but the city was determined to tear it down, thereby not even giving money, $250 to move if you were white. If you were African American, you didn't even get that much money. You didn't even apply for it. You simply scattered into other neighborhoods, or you went north. So this is part of that drive north out Cleveland Avenue, in which, where the arrows are there, it says Hudson Manor is restricted and surrounded by restricted property, thus assuring its future. Well, it certainly did. And Fifth Avenue becomes the first color line, and then Hudson will become the next color line. And when Clarence Lumpkin, the iconic leader of Linden, says, "I didn't choose my house because it was pretty or it was nice. It was the only place I could find," we're talking about this neighborhood. Let's go on to the next slide, and you'll see it continues to go up further in through the sections that became the World War II housing of Galbraith, and in through Linden, even into the 40s and the 50s. And let's go on to the next slide. And that would be one of the more the Kenmore Knolls, which is now somewhat more modeled, like it starts to break the grid pattern. The houses are more on irregular shapes. And again, it will say very boldly, $200 to $500 for restricted residential sites. In some cases, there was one baby farm, which is going right out Morris Road to the first intersection after 71. And back there are lots were sold as baby farm. You could buy 8 of them to start a truck garden. And it was open house, come view it, build your own house. And in a little tiny box in the corner, it says 5 pounds free sugar, 5-pound bag of free sugar will be given to every white family who visits on a certain day. So this is pre-redlining. What happens in the 1930s as part of the New Deal policies are that it was an attempt by Roosevelt to give low-income mortgages to African American, But in doing so, this was, of course, nationally, there were various projections done in geographic studies. So to be careful what you ask for. And the geographic studies revealed very clearly poor neighborhoods in low income and where they were living in every city in the United States. And that data just was so enticing that the next thing you know is they decided to give it to the banks. And that's how the banks come up with redlining. Oh, it's a US document. And, you know, it's been certified and going to use it somehow. And this is how we're going to use it. Let's go to the next slide. In 1947, the Urban Land Institute, a venerable institution, started in 1938 and put out a handbook called the Community Builders Handbook. It was a guide for shopping center developers. And of course, the first shopping center in the United States built by Casto Sr. was Town and Country, and then went on to build 9 others, including Northern Lights, which Linden did not want because they knew it would become essentially used car lots because the next one was already being planned at Northland. It's just, and we see it today. Easton and then Polaris. It's just simply moving outward. But the Community Builders Handbook specifically gave examples of what you want to do if you're a shopping center builder. You want to make friends with the neighbors, the new suburbanites all around you, because inevitably there'll be some traffic problem or noise problem, and they're going to want to have access to you, and you want a good reputation, so you want to be a problem solver and meet with them. But the second reason is because you want to go to the neighborhood around and you want to say, keep your restrictive clauses strong. Here are examples of them, and specify no Negroes, no Jews. Okay, next slide. Of all of the communities that have sort of an interesting history to think about, it's not just about race, but it's about the actual building size. The size of the building, and especially the front yard setback, often determines the level, of course, of the income level that we'll be buying. And in the early days of the 20s, as this is going on, people were encouraged to buy multiple housing so that it was not only restricted, but they already were taking possible home ownership, if you could get it, off the market and only into renters. But Grandview has an interesting history in that it prohibited people of Italian descent. And most people are shocked by that. They say, no, Grandview is Italian. No, it depends on what side of Fifth Avenue you're on. And in fact, Grandview waited to draw its boundaries of the city where there was already settlement. And so there are 2 houses on Wyandotte Avenue where 2 Italian families live next door to each other. And they drew the city boundary behind their house. Okay, let's go to the next one. Next slide. Okay, so what makes a neighborhood? Things to think about. First of all, it's a lot about pride. It's a fierce loyalty to a physical location. And I almost think there is a direct correlation that if the neighborhood has a difficult history in terms of how you want to define that, it's important because it is remembered by those who lived through it in the 3 generations who will remember it or 4 as a victory. So it is not ancient history. It is out there. The next slide. Previous policies, the recognition that policies are often outside of local control, which Kyle really brought up too. The neighborhood had no voice at the time of these great changes, and generational memory is important to validate. Okay, the next slide. And that it be authentic history. Please remember this. We have to recognize forgotten migrations. 3 Appalachian migrations have never been acknowledged. In the 1960s and 70s, Victorian Village was the place of best absorption by Appalachian families. Movement out to the west side has been of Appalachian. I can tell you from working at students in West High School and students at Lyndon McKinley, if I ask them what they want out of their lives or what was the one thing they would want more than any, their answers will reflect a cultural pattern of what their families have determined is important. And I won't go further than that, but I'd be happy to later. And that places of new opportunity, the new voices, really have to be, I don't want to say assimilated, but they have to be valued in a different way so that they don't become the gated communities that we might have seen on the South Side. So the Baldwin quote about difficult history has to be recognized. And if it's not, it really is criminal, is, I guess, the strongest message I can have, along with unanticipated consequences. So thank you.
Doreen, thank you so much. Doreen, thank you so much. That was a great presentation and a lot of great information that I think is important as we contextualize everything that's happening. And I think the Baldwin quote was the perfect finale, because although we did have a lot of migrations and immigration, we have times where people move out and come back in. And so thinking about the histories of those folks is very helpful as we're thinking about doing our lines. Commissioners, any questions? Oh, hearing none from the commissioners. Doreen, just want to thank you again for your fantastic presentation. And we had a question come in from Facebook that is actually probably a little bit for both you and Kyle. Either one of you, I'm sure, could answer something like this. But it is, were there any Columbus politicians or developers in particular who pushed the policies of segregation? So you kind of hinted at that throughout your presentations, but anyone come to mind?
I can think of one in particular, if that's all right. And I certainly bow to Kyle. King Thompson developed Upper Arlington. Before Upper Arlington was developed, he built almost extensively in the university area in a couple places which are now historic districts. Indianola Forest, Iuke Ravine, they're contiguous historic districts. Some of the other things in the north side. And they were fine, stately homes done generally in arts and crafts style on spacious lots or irregular lots if they were on ravines. Within a year after they were built, pictures of those homes that he built were now put in an Upper Arlington promotional booklet with an apartment building that was sitting on the backyard of that house, right at the corner, for instance, of Lane and Indianola. And it with a bold headline that said, "This will never happen here." In other words, Arlington, he never admitted that he had built that other house in the first place. But now that he was in Arlington, it was not going to happen. And that property did not bear the restrictive covenant he had put on the house. So thank goodness, I guess it wasn't exactly an equals of trade-off, but it is strictly the profit motive of developers. And the other was Johnson Pavey, all of Clintonville. That streetcar suburb line, and you can track all those deeds.
Thank you. Thank you. Kyle, did you have any? Oh, no problem. Well, yeah, Doreen, thank you. I think that was very good information. But we do want to thank our presenters, both Kyle Strickland and Doreen Sauer, for joining us today. And I want to thank our community members for your engagement with the presentations tonight. And so with that, we've completed the presentation portion of our evening and want to share the following information before we conclude our meeting. Our next meeting will be 1 week from today, Wednesday, May 19th at 6 p.m. for our first quadrant meeting, which will focus on the north quadrant of the city. Look out for advisories and instruction on how to join this meeting coming out in the next few days. At these next few meetings, we want to hear from you, the Columbus residents. We truly hope you will join us on Wednesday, especially if you live on the north side of the city. If you want to learn more about the work of the Council Residential Districting Commission or view the meeting series schedule, please visit www.columbus.gov/districtingcommission. If you have any questions, please email crdc@columbus.gov. And with that, we're done. We conclude. Thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you.